We'd like to share our experiences running online recitation sessions for MITx MicroMasters courses in Statistics and Data Science and how they might be a model for MIT residential courses as you move online. My name is Brandon Muramatsu. I'm joined by Glenda Stump in this presentation, and along with Andre Salazar, we've been running a project that we'll talk a little bit about. Our project context is that we have a wraparound for courses in the MITx MicroMasters in Statistics and Data Science. We call these facilitated sessions. They're basically online recitation sessions. We use a third-party approach, so we're working with a university in another country that's using these courses as part of a master's program. What we do is we provide some additional support, workshops, these online recitation sessions. We do this in parallel to the publicly running online MOOC versions of the courses. We use a team approach combining both TAs and staff to help design and offer each of these online recitation sessions. There are about 30 learners per session. Usually we only see about 20 of them, and we have two facilitators. So we run a morning session and an afternoon session with the same content, same materials, and a little bit about our students. They're taking these courses and this master's program as working professionals, so they're doing it in addition to their day jobs. And as it turns out, we're working with non-native English speakers, although all of the sessions we offer are in English. Why do we think this might be applicable to MIT residential courses? Well, the MITx MicroMasters courses are Introduction to Probability, Data Analysis for Social Scientists, Machine Learning with Python, and Fundamentals of Statistics. These are typical MIT engineering, math, physical sciences sorts of courses. Also, I can say from personal experience that the types of courses we're working with, as well as the approach we've taken, would have been applicable in all the courses I took as part of my mechanical engineering degrees. In your case, you might be doing this as part of a team or possibly solo. Either way works out. We think the team approach works a little bit better. There are a lot of things to keep track of in each of the sessions, a lot to prepare for. We find it's helpful to be able to draw upon different strengths and experiences in putting together each of the sessions, but you can certainly do this as a one-person shop. If it's possible, at least for the first few sessions, it might be helpful to have a colleague sit in to help you sort of manage the session. There's a lot of things to keep track of. One other thing, we do this in about an hour and a half session. You can scale the activities to fit the time. So if you're only doing a 1 hour recitation, you can certainly change the amount of materials you cover to fit within the time frame. Next, my colleague Glenda Stump will talk about the background for how we put together each of the sessions and the approach we're taking, what we do in each of the sessions, and talk a little bit about why this all works from a learning theory perspective.
Hi, I'm Glenda Stump, an education research scientist from Open Learning, and I have the pleasure of working with the CoLab team to train facilitators for the program, as well as to develop materials for the facilitated sessions. In this presentation, I will describe our sessions and our pedagogical approach. This part of the presentation is divided into 3 segments. I will first briefly describe our sessions and the role and responsibilities of the facilitator. I'll then talk about student engagement and active learning, and in a third segment, I'll talk more about instructional strategies that can be used, and then planning and conducting a facilitated session or a recitation. So for this first segment, the intended learning outcomes are that you should be able to describe the basic structure of a facilitated session and describe the facilitator's role and responsibilities for managing that session. Our facilitated sessions are conducted online in a synchronous session. They're led by MIT facilitators. They're held once per week throughout the course. They last an hour and a half. And they follow a lesson plan that's prepared in advance. The lesson plan contains intended learning outcomes for the students, and then selected concepts or skills associated with the material for that week. The sessions contain a concept or a poll question and worked examples, and these help to clarify key concepts that are emphasized in the edX course. And they're also conducted in English. The facilitators are expected to learn features of the delivery platform, such as the breakout rooms, how to manage chat, how to deliver poll questions, how to record sessions, those kinds of things. Their role also includes interacting with the learners in an LMS discussion forum to answer questions between sessions. And they prepare material before every session, a lesson plan, as I mentioned earlier, with related slides or code. They interact with other course facilitators to develop and revise materials. And then as the course progresses, we also sometimes make adjustments depending on the type of feedback we get from the students. And then they facilitate one session per week. In the next segment, we describe how to keep students actively engaged in the learning process. By the end of this segment, you should be able to describe strategies that promote student engagement and describe modes of student engagement as identified in the ICAP framework. So what does promote student engagement in online learning experiences? A recent study examined comments from over 4,500 students enrolled in 10 of the most highly evaluated MOOCs. The most frequently cited or mentioned factors that they enjoyed were, first of all, problem-centered learning, focusing on meaning-making with real-world examples. They appreciated active learning, supported by timely feedback, something that required students to think of applying the content learned rather than simply regurgitating the information. They appreciated course resources that allow for diverse learning needs or preferences, optional challenges, additional outside resources for extra practice or help, chunked video sequences with inline or in-video quizzes. They also mentioned instructor attributes. Enthusiasm is important. They liked peer interaction. They liked organized time for students to exchange ideas. In our project, we did this in an initial workshop. We organized students in groups and had them interact frequently during a workshop, and then we continued that group process or those group interactions throughout our online recitation sections. And students do enjoy that. Students also in the study appreciated instructor accessibility, just regular time to answer questions, like for office hours. So some of these factors are provided in the course materials themselves, but also these can be provided in facilitated sessions or recitations as well. As you probably noticed, active learning was cited as being positive by the students in the study I just mentioned. When you design activities for a session, it is also important to think about exactly how engaged or active you expect your students to be. So active learning has a lot of definitions. To create a working definition of active learning, Freeman and colleagues collected written definitions from 338 audience members before departmental seminars on active learning at universities throughout the United States and Canada. They then coded elements in the responses to create the following consensus definition, which was then used as a standard for active learning in their research, and is a pretty well-known study, which I've cited at the end. I'm sure you would enjoy reading. Their work resulted in the definition you see on this slide. Active learning engages students in the process of learning through activities and/or discussion in class, as opposed to passively listening to an expert. It emphasizes higher order thinking and often involves group work. So I'm going to talk about a framework that helps us to plan active learning activities. This framework suggests that the extent of overt or visible engagement of the students is an indicator of their internal cognitive processes. So think about these 4 questions as you plan activities. What are you asking students to do? Are you asking them to sit quietly and listen? Are you asking them to manipulate the learning material in some way? For example, use a formula to solve a problem, follow lab instructions, remember a rule or a law, or match a concept with a definition. Are you asking them to make an inference or construct a product that goes beyond the information that you give them? Or are you asking them to interact with each other to make inferences or construct products that go beyond the information you give them? These questions help us to think about activities as described in the ICAP framework. The name ICAP comes from the modes of engagement: interactive, constructive, active, and passive. This framework posits that the extent of student engagement can be thought of hierarchically, and the modes of engagement are what we see students overtly or visibly doing. This mode of engagement gives us an indication of what they're thinking or doing cognitively. So to go through these, in the lower right-hand corner you'll see passive. When a learner is engaged in the passive mode or is in the passive mode, they're receiving information. They're listening to an explanation. They're watching a video. And this mode of engagement helps learners to store information, but they don't really embed it in relevant schema. Cognitively, it leads to storage of new knowledge, but that knowledge tends to be isolated. In terms of outcomes, students can often recall that knowledge verbatim in identical contexts, like using the same procedure. Next up the hierarchy is active mode of engagement. And this is when students manipulate the information or focus on it. You can do that by taking verbatim notes, by plugging numbers into a given formula, by even when you're reading something, underlining it, highlighting it, or pointing towards it. If the activity is completing a worksheet, an active mode of engagement can include recalling information that has just been given to you. So cognitively, when students are in this mode, they're integrating new information into existing knowledge. Cognitively, the existing schema is more complete and coherent, and it's strengthened somewhat. In terms of outcomes, after students engage in an active mode, they can apply that knowledge to similar but non-identical contexts. Next up the hierarchy is a constructive mode of engagement. In this mode, the learner is generating information or producing output that goes beyond the ideas presented to them. They're self-constructing information by explaining something or elaborating in their own words. They're justifying their rationale for response, providing reasons for their thinking, synthesizing information by constructing a concept map or drawing a representation of it. They're generating hypotheses, or they're comparing and contrasting objects. So cognitively, when students engage in this manner, they're inferring new knowledge. Their existing knowledge then becomes enriched and more detailed. Their schema can become linked with other knowledge and integrated with that knowledge. In terms of outcomes, when students learn or engage in this mode, they then are able to transfer the knowledge that they've learned to new contexts. And finally, the highest mode, or on the hierarchy, the higher mode, is the interactive mode of engagement. And this is when there's productive dialogue between two people. They co-infer or co-construct knowledge by building on another person's ideas, responding to feedback, defending an idea, or challenging someone else's idea. And it truly needs to be a back and forth. They need to build on each other's ideas. If one person just makes a statement and the person that they're partnering with just nods their head and says, "I agree," that's truly not an interactive mode of engagement. They need to have a back and forth conversation, and as I said, explain things to each other, challenge each other to explain, add to the other's explanation, and really do a co-constructive exercise. So, cognitively, new knowledge can emerge from these joint creating processes, something that neither partner knew previously. In terms of outcomes, new knowledge and perspectives can allow partners to invent new products, procedures, or ideas. When we talk about activities that elicit these modes of engagement, we refer to them as passive, active, constructive, or interactive activities. It's important to remember that these are modes of engagement rather than types of learning. So it's the way students are engaging with the material. Interactive, constructive, and active modes all describe the concept or idea of active learning. The framework just gives us some ideas about which kinds of activities might be better than others. For example, if I ask you to read the list of topics to be discussed in one of the MITx courses, what mode of engagement might that be? If you thought passive, you're right. Just reading is a passive mode of engagement. But if I then ask you to summarize the focus of the course in your own words and contrast that with any previous courses you've had, what mode might that be? If you thought constructive, you're right. You're actually synthesizing something, putting it in your own words, comparing and contrasting makes you construct information or build information. And if I ask you to talk to your neighbor and you argued a bit about your responses because they differed, if they explained what they thought and you disagreed with them and you finally agreed on your collective response, you're probably thinking, yes, that's interactive, and you would be correct. That is an interactive mode of engagement. So you see, each of these modes has potential to result in a different depth of learning. Research has shown that when students are engaged in one of the deeper modes, either constructively or interactively, they do learn better. So thinking about activities in this way helps us plan activities that not only fit our lessons, but are derived in a theoretically effective way. So if you just follow a list of activities, and sometimes, you can find on the internet or you can be given like lists of activities that are called active. So if you kind of follow those lists and do what they say and they don't seem to work with your students, you have no reason, you have no understanding of why they didn't work. These particular principles help you to think about, what am I really asking my students to do? Am I asking them to just merely manipulate the material? Or am I asking them to go beyond the information that I've given them, to construct some knowledge for themselves? Or am I asking them to interact with other students to do that? I have to say that there's a caveat to the interactive mode, and that is they have to have a constructive task to do. So if it's not a task that asks them to go beyond the information that they've been given, it will not produce an interactive mode of engagement. So that's important to remember. The ICAP hypothesis just says that the interactive mode produces better learning than the constructive mode. The constructive mode produces better learning than the active mode, and so forth. The constructive and interactive modes of engagement usually result in deeper learning than the active and passive modes. And this has been shown in some of the research that I've cited at the end of the presentation. At this point in the training, I typically interact with my participants and give them some examples and ask them what mode of engagement they are, and I don't have that opportunity in this presentation, but I am going to give you some examples, and I hope that you think about these as I go through them. So using the ICAP framework, what mode of engagement should the following activities produce? After giving information about a topic, you would group the students into groups of 4 and ask them to take 5 minutes to decide on the one question they think is crucial for you to answer at that very moment. Should that activity elicit an active, constructive, or interactive mode of engagement? So if you're thinking about this as a constructive task, you're correct. Formulating a good question is a constructive task if it's detailed, right? If you just talked about eigenvectors and the question they formulated was, what is an eigenvector? That's not very detailed or in-depth thinking. And so that's really not a constructive mode of engagement on their part. But if they ask a good question, a good detailed question, that requires them to take information that they've heard and synthesize it and put it together in a new way. And so that's a constructive mode of engagement. If they're interacting in a group, which I said that you would group them into 4s, if they're interacting in a group and having back and forth conversation, maybe talking about which might be a better question or adding different elements to the question as one person suggests it, then that would then become an interactive mode of engagement for those participants. It's a constructive task, so asking them to decide on a question that they think is important, and they've done it as a group. If they've done it as a group with a lot of back and forth, that would then become an interactive mode of engagement. Here's another example, and this comes from one of the courses that we used in the project, one of the statistics and data analysis MicroMasters courses. For the experiment of flipping a coin, determine whether we have a legitimate sample space for the statement below. And you can read that omega equals, and then the statements are heads and it's raining, heads and it is not raining. So the instructions are to state your answer and explain the rationale for your choice. For this example, simply choosing an answer, which is yes, it's a legitimate sample space, or no, it's not a legitimate sample space, is really based on recall of material given in the lecture, and that makes it active. However, explaining the rationale for your choice is a constructive task, because you have to think about why you chose the response and explain it in your own words. This example then would elicit a constructive mode of engagement. Again, choosing an answer from a multiple choice, right? Choosing is really an active task, but explaining the choice and explaining why you chose it is a constructive task. And then here's another one. So this is a true or false question, and there obviously was a chart that accompanied this, but the question or the statement was, the chart below supports that increased glyphosate use over time has led to an increase in the number of cases of autism among children aged 6 to 21 years. What additional evidence is needed to support this claim? So here again, the students are choosing, or you're asked to choose true or false, right? And so the act, the visible act that you're doing is choosing. That's an active mode of engagement. But asking for additional evidence requires the learners to think beyond the material given. So they have to look at what other evidence is given in this scenario and think about what evidence would support the claim. That then becomes a constructive mode of engagement to answer that. And here's another one. So after an experience or activity in class, ask students to reflect upon and write what they learned, so what, meaning why is this important and what are the implications, and now what, how to apply it or do things differently. This is a constructive task in that the learner has to synthesize the information they heard into responses for those 3 questions. However, there's a caveat, of course. If you, the instructor, specifically tell them this information in class, then the learner doesn't have to construct a response. They only have to remember what you said. So if they write your statements verbatim, then they are engaging in an active mode. That's really copying, right? But if the instructor does not give them that information, just gives them the factual or presentation, and the students have to synthesize that then is a constructive mode of engagement. And here's the last example. So this is one from one of our facilitated sessions. Students were learning about multiple regression. And as you can see, we gave them the context of a problem, that's the information on the left, along with the output from the regression analysis. I'll give you just a second to kind of skim through that. What they were asked to do was choose all of the correct statements. So they did this individually, and then they broke into groups and discussed their answers and why they chose them. So the groups then came back and after they had reached consensus, and they revoted, supplying justification for their new responses. This activity is initially active, and as I said before, so selecting a correct response is an active, what we see visibly is an active behavior, right? But justification or explaining the reasoning is a constructive task, okay? So they did this actually in a group, or were asked to do it in a group, explain the rationale, and then come to a consensus. A constructive task done as a group with good back and forth communication or back and forth exchanges then becomes an interactive mode of engagement. In many of these examples, you saw that the question offered multiple choice responses, and this is really common in an online setting. As I said, the act of choosing was only active. So you might be thinking, well, why is this? Because choosing the correct response requires some thinking and reasoning. This could be considered going beyond the information that it's given. So the reason it's considered active, according to the ICAP theory or hypothesis, is because ICAP focuses on what learners are overtly or visibly doing. Okay, so in this case, they're simply choosing an answer. That's all we can see. They may be thinking very hard. They may be thinking, reasoning very well, but we don't see that. All we see is them choosing an answer. But they can also be guessing and not doing sophisticated reasoning, as we might imagine. The reason that's considered active is because, again, the ICAP framework deals with what we overtly or visibly see. However, if we ask learners to explain their reasoning in writing or verbally, then we have evidence of their reasoning, and we can see that they've gone beyond the information given, and that task then becomes a constructive task. Another very important consideration when planning active learning activities is whether one person will be actively engaged, as you can see in this drawing, or if all learners will be engaged. So when planning activities in any context, this principle is important. However, it becomes even more important in an online context because learners have greater opportunities to become distracted when they're in their own environments and out of view of the instructor. We try to plan activities that require all learners to be involved in responding in some manner. Otherwise, some may sit passively, just present but without cognitively engaging in the material. So in the next segment, we'll discuss activities that help to achieve the goal of engaging all learners.